My name is Harold S. Miller. I'm 76 years old, a widower of 12 years, and until recently, I lived in the same house where my wife and I raised our only child, our daughter, Melissa. It's a 2-story red brick home with creaking floorboards, ivy on the porch columns, and a backyard where I planted tomatoes every spring and built a swing set when Melissa was 6. I never left the house after my wife, Anne, passed away. Some men remarry or move to be closer to their children, but I stayed where I was, as if staying put would hold on to some part of her, something not yet taken by time. Anne died of lung cancer, quick and brutal. She didn't even smoke, never did, but that's how it goes sometimes. I remember sitting beside her hospice bed, feeding her crushed ice with a spoon as she drifted in and out of lucidity, her eyes already more focused on some distant point beyond this world than on me. After she was gone, the house changed its tone. It stopped being our home and turned into something closer to a museum, or perhaps a tomb. But I didn't mind. I had my routines. Morning coffee at precisely 7:15, eggs scrambled the way she used to make them, trimmed roses every Thursday, and I always wrote her a note in the notebook she kept by the kitchen window. "Good morning, Annie," I'd begin, followed by the weather, my plans, my memories from that date a year ago, 5 years ago, 40 years ago. I never missed a day. Melissa, our daughter, had been distant for a long time, even before Anne's illness. She visited on birthdays and holidays at first, then it became only Christmas, and finally, not at all. I knew she was busy. She had a job in the city, real estate, marketing, something in that orbit that changes its name every few years but is always about profit and competition. Her husband, Clark, worked in tech. They had 2 children, my grandchildren, whom I'd seen maybe a dozen times in the last 10 years. One of them, Ellie, sent me a thank you card 5 years ago after I mailed her a $100 check for her birthday. I kept that card on my fridge for 3 years, until the magnet cracked and it fell behind the stove. I never put it back up, but I didn't throw it away either. It's still in the drawer next to my can opener, under the rubber bands and expired coupons. Melissa and I weren't estranged, at least not officially. She called once a month, like clockwork, always on a Sunday evening. The conversations lasted less than 6 minutes. She'd ask how I was, I'd say, "Still standing," and she'd chuckle politely, ask if I needed anything. I'd say no, and that would be the end of it. Every now and then she'd say something about getting together soon, and then work would get in the way. I told myself she was just a busy woman with her own life. I didn't want to be the kind of father who makes his children feel guilty. Anne used to say I had too much pride for my own good, and she wasn't wrong. The house needed repairs. The roof leaked after every big rain, and the upstairs windows stuck when the weather turned humid. I tried to fix things myself, but my knees don't let me climb ladders anymore, and my hands tremble too much for the small tools. Still, I managed. I budgeted carefully. I never spent more than I earned. Social Security, a modest pension, and a lifetime of frugality kept me afloat. I wasn't rich, but I had no debts, and I didn't owe anyone anything. Sometimes the silence in the house became too much, and I'd go sit on the porch just to hear the birds or the neighbor's dog bark at passing squirrels. That was how I measured time, by changes in weather, the sounds outside, the way light moved through the windows. A few months ago, Melissa came by out of the blue. I remember the day exactly. It was a Saturday in late February, unseasonably warm, the kind of day where the snow starts to melt but the wind still bites through your coat. She pulled up in a new SUV, stepped out in a gray pantsuit and heels, looking every bit like a woman who hasn't touched a garden hose in 20 years. She smiled, kissed my cheek without really touching it, and said, "Dad, we need to talk." The last time she'd used those words, Anne had just been diagnosed. "We need to talk" was never good news. She came inside, commented on the smell of the house, something about old air, and sat down at the kitchen table like a guest in a bed and breakfast. She said she'd been looking into estate planning. Said it was time we got serious about long-term decisions. That she was worried about me living alone. That the house was too big. That in the event of an emergency, she'd have no legal authority to make decisions. You know, she added, God forbid something happens. I don't want to be scrambling to figure out what to do with the house. I told her I wasn't planning to die anytime soon. She laughed, but it wasn't a kind laugh. It was the kind that people use to dismiss what they don't want to deal with. She pulled out a folder with legal documents already printed and ready. It's a quit-claim deed, she said. You just sign here, and it'll transfer the title to me. You'll still live here, of course. Nothing changes, but it'll make things simpler for me later. I hesitated. It wasn't that I didn't trust her. I didn't even let the thought in. But something about how quickly she moved through the explanation, how prepared she was, made me uneasy. I asked if I could think about it, maybe speak to someone. She said, "Of course, Dad," but the smile faded a little. I spent the next 3 nights rereading the document, not really understanding the legalese but recognizing the finality of it. I kept thinking, Anne would know what to do. She always read the fine print. She would have seen through this, or maybe she wouldn't. Maybe I was just being paranoid. By the 4th day, I signed it. Melissa came by again 2 days later, this time with Clark. He didn't come inside, just waited in the car while Melissa retrieved the signed papers. She kissed my cheek again, thanked me, and said, "You won't regret it." I stood on the porch waving as they drove away, wondering what exactly I had just given up. I told myself it was the right thing. What would I need a house for in 10 years? 5 years? Better it go to someone who would take care of it, who could make it part of her future. That night I made my usual tea, sat in the living room and listened to the old floor heater click and groan. For the first time in years I felt like a guest in my own home. I couldn't explain why, but something had shifted. The silence wasn't peaceful anymore. It was loaded, like the breath before an argument. I stayed up late that night watching the moon move across the hallway wall, trying to tell myself that nothing had changed. But something had. I just didn't know how much. Not yet. It was the morning after I signed the deed when I first noticed the unfamiliar sound of a car engine outside my window. It was early. Too early for visitors, and I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, the kind I brewed every day with a pinch of cinnamon, a habit Anne picked up from her grandmother and passed down to me. I pulled the curtain back slightly and saw a dark blue van parked in the driveway, its back doors open, and 3 young people carrying suitcases and large duffel bags up the front walk. At first, I thought they had the wrong address. Perhaps they were friends of the neighbors or some kind of delivery service. But then I saw one of them take a key from his pocket, my key, and unlock the door. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what I was seeing. Then I opened the front door just as the last of them stepped inside, and I called out, "Excuse me, can I help you?" A young woman with short purple hair turned around and smiled brightly, as if I were the one intruding. "Hi." "You must be Harold," she said cheerfully. "Melissa told us you'd be here. I'm Zoe. That's Brent and Sam. We're renting the upstairs rooms for a few weeks. Don't worry, we're super chill. We'll stay out of your way." I blinked, trying to process her words. "Renting?" I repeated. "What do you mean, renting?" Brent, a tall man in a puffer vest, brushed past me with a speaker system under his arm. "Yeah, we booked through a listing. Said it was an artist's retreat, real cozy. Your daughter showed us pictures. This place is awesome." I followed them inside, my heart pounding. Melissa hadn't said anything about renting out the house. She hadn't even mentioned that she had keys copied. The living room already looked different. One of them had moved the coffee table to make room for their luggage, and someone had plugged a laptop into the TV. The smell of my furniture cleaner was already drowned out by some kind of herbal oil diffuser they had set up on the bookshelf. I tried calling Melissa immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hit the right buttons on the phone. Straight to voicemail. I left a message, tried again 20 minutes later, and again after that. Nothing. Meanwhile, Zoe and the others made themselves at home, claiming the upstairs bedrooms and stacking takeout containers in the fridge. When I told them there must be a misunderstanding, Zoe just laughed and said, "It's all handled through your daughter. She said you'd be fine with it, that you were excited to have some young energy in the house." That last part made something tighten in my chest. Excited. I hadn't felt excitement in years, and certainly not at the idea of strangers sleeping in the rooms where my wife used to keep her quilted linens and where I stored photo albums in the closets. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't used to confrontation. I spent the next 2 days in a state of anxious confusion, eating little, sleeping less. I stayed in my downstairs bedroom and tried to avoid the newcomers, who were mostly polite but dismissive in that way young people can be when they assume someone old has no authority left. One night I heard loud music and laughter from upstairs, and I climbed the stairs, slowly, holding the banister like a lifeline, to ask them to keep it down. They looked surprised to see me. Brent offered me a beer, Sam turned the music down by a notch, and Zoe told me with a grin, "You should come hang out sometime, Mr. Miller. You look like you could use some fun." I didn't answer. I just turned and walked back down, ashamed of the tears stinging my eyes. By the third day, I finally reached Melissa. Her tone was clipped and professional, like she was on a call with a client she didn't particularly like. "Dad, it's just temporary," she said. "I told you the house is in my name now. I have the right to do what I want with it." I tried to argue, asked why she hadn't told me, why she'd let strangers move into my house without a word. "You said you didn't mind me handling the big stuff," she said. "This is the big stuff. You're getting older, you're lonely, and I thought some company would be good for you. You always say the house is too quiet." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I told her I felt blindsided, humiliated, betrayed. "Dad, don't be dramatic," she snapped. "This is what's best for everyone. You'll get used to it. I even set aside the guest room for you. It's the one with the garden view. That's your new room." That word, guest, cut deeper than I expected. I had lived in this house for over 40 years, built every cabinet with my own hands, installed the storm windows myself before Melissa was even born. Now I was being offered a corner of it, like a tenant. I told her I wanted the arrangement reversed, that I wanted the renters out. She sighed and said, "Dad, it's already booked through the end of the month. I can't just kick them out. That would be illegal. Look, just relax. Go for a walk, read your books, do your crossword puzzles. Let me handle things." Then she hung up before I could say another word. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat in my chair by the window and stared out at the empty street, the orange glow of the street lamp flickering across the sidewalk where Anne used to rake leaves into perfect piles. I thought of the conversation we had the year before she died, when she said she worried about Melissa's coldness. "She's got ambition, Harold, but she's losing her soul," she'd whispered as if afraid Melissa might somehow hear her from across the state. I'd brushed it off then, told her not to worry, that our daughter was just strong-willed. Now I saw the truth in Anne's voice. Melissa hadn't just changed. She had removed me from her heart long ago, and I had refused to see it. Over the next week, more strangers arrived. Apparently, Melissa had listed the property on some website, advertising it as a multi-room creative retreat for remote workers and traveling students. I started to see new faces every few days, some polite, some indifferent. One even asked me if I was the groundskeeper. When I told him I owned the house, he looked confused. "I thought this was Melissa's place," he said, frowning. "She handles the payments and everything." I wanted to scream. Instead, I nodded and excused myself, retreating back to the guest room that now held all my belongings. Some of them hastily moved there by Zoe and her friends to make room for their stuff. I stopped making coffee in the morning because the kitchen was always occupied. My cereal boxes were shoved to the back of the pantry, and my milk was used without permission. The renters were not cruel, but they didn't see me. I was background, a fixture, a man who had clearly outlived his function and whose presence was an inconvenience. I started walking the neighborhood more often, even when my knees protested. I couldn't stand being in the house anymore. The air felt wrong. The walls no longer held my memories. They were filled instead with music I didn't understand and the smell of other people's lives. One afternoon, I returned from a walk and found the front door wide open, my framed wedding photo knocked off the wall and lying cracked on the floor. No one knew how it had happened. Brent apologized vaguely, said someone might have bumped into it. I picked up the pieces without a word, took the photograph back to my room, and wrapped it in an old towel. That night I sat on the edge of my bed with the photo in my hands and whispered, "I'm sorry, Annie. I should have known better." That was the moment I realized I wasn't just being pushed aside. I was being erased. Systematically, quietly, efficiently. I no longer owned my home. I no longer had a seat at my own table. I had become a relic, one that could be stored away or moved as needed, so long as it didn't interfere. And the worst part was that I had allowed it. I had signed the paper. I had trusted the daughter who now rented out the upstairs to strangers and gave me a room like a favor. I had done this to myself. But what they hadn't counted on, what Melissa never imagined, was that I might still have enough strength left to fight back. It had been 2 weeks since the first batch of renters moved in, and by then, my life had changed so thoroughly and so quietly that it was hard to pinpoint when exactly the last piece of my dignity slipped through my fingers. I no longer woke up with a sense of ownership over my space. My days began and ended in the same small second-floor guest room that Melissa had deemed sufficient for me. The bed was too low and soft for my joints, and the window faced a brick wall rather than the garden I had once pruned with such pride. My belongings, what little I had left access to, had been reduced to a suitcase and a few boxes, hastily packed and tucked beneath the bed. Melissa, I assumed, believed she was being generous. She had spared me from eviction after all. She had allowed me to remain, though not as a father or patriarch, but as a tolerated afterthought. The house now had its own rhythm, one I no longer influenced. Renters came and went, some staying a weekend, others longer. One woman held loud Zoom meetings in the living room every morning, her voice filling the house with terms like KP is and client churn. A man with a man bun and a walking stick claimed the garage as his yoga studio and put up paper signs asking people not to disturb his sacred energy flow. Someone burned incense that made my eyes sting. I complained once, and Zoe laughed like I'd told a charming story from the war. "Oh, Harold," she said, "you're such a character." I wasn't trying to be a character. I was trying to exist. Melissa didn't return my calls. When I emailed her to ask for an explanation, she replied curtly that I needed to adapt to modern living situations. She insisted that the arrangement was temporary and that the house needed to generate income to cover maintenance. I had spent 40 years maintaining the house myself, from replacing floorboards to installing gutters. Now, I was being told by my own daughter that the property had outgrown me, that my role was no longer caretaker, but cost. I tried contacting Clark, her husband, hoping he might inject some sense into her, but his response was colder still. "Melissa's doing what's best for the family," he wrote. "You should support her instead of making things more difficult." At night, I lay awake listening to music through the walls. Music I couldn't name, genres I didn't understand, beats that made the floorboards tremble beneath me. One renter, a 20-something with tattoos and a wireless speaker, threw a party on the back deck. I counted 19 people, none of whom acknowledged my presence when I stepped outside to ask them to turn down the volume. One man handed me a plastic cup and said, "Cool place, dude. Are you the Airbnb guy?" I turned and went back to my room without speaking. I didn't know how to answer that question anymore. Was I the Airbnb guy? Was I a squatter in my own house? A relic they forgot to remove? The final straw came on a Thursday morning when I attempted to cook breakfast for myself. I'd gone into the kitchen early before most of the renters were awake. I pulled out eggs, butter, a pan I recognized from my old set, at least they hadn't thrown it out, and began preparing scrambled eggs the way Anne used to make them. I'd just poured them into the skillet when Zoe walked in, still in her bathrobe, with a mug in her hand and her phone pressed to her ear. She looked at the stove, then at me, and frowned. Harold, the kitchen's kind of reserved in the mornings. Brent has a cooking vlog he films around 10, and the smell of eggs lingers. I stared at her, spatula in hand. It's 7:30, I said. That's 2.5 hours from now. She shrugged. Yeah, but we've got prep and lighting and stuff. Could you maybe finish up fast? Or, I don't know, eat out today? I didn't reply. I turned off the stove, scraped the half-cooked eggs into the trash, and returned to my room. I didn't eat that day. Later that afternoon, I overheard Zoe talking on the phone in the hallway, her voice casual and amused. Yeah, it's weird. The old guy? He lives here, I guess. Melissa said he used to own the house or something. He just kind of shuffles around, mostly keeps to himself. Honestly, it's like having a grandpa ghost. He's harmless. That word, harmless, clanged in my ears like a bell. I was no longer a man, not even an obstacle. I was background noise, like the creak of the stairs or the ticking of the old clock in the hallway. My presence was so inconsequential that people talked about me in the third person while I stood 10 feet away. That evening, I decided to go to City Hall. I didn't know exactly what I hoped to find, some bureaucratic loophole, a regulation, anything, but I needed answers. I brought the deed papers Melissa had left me, my old tax records, and a fading photo of Anne and me on the porch, just in case someone needed to see that I belonged. The woman at the counter was kind, middle-aged with reading glasses perched on her head. She reviewed the document slowly, then looked up at me with something between sympathy and resignation. I'm sorry, Mr. Miller. According to the county registry, the house was transferred into your daughter's name 3 weeks ago. The transaction is legally binding. There's nothing we can do. I asked if there was any chance it could be reversed, but she shook her head. Unless you can prove fraud or coercion, it's done. Did you sign these papers voluntarily? I nodded, reluctantly. She sighed. I understand this is upsetting. You're not the first. I walked home in a daze. The sidewalks felt longer than usual, the world too bright. I thought about Anne again, about how she used to walk this route with her hand in the crook of my arm, stopping to point out gardens she liked. I wondered what she would have said if she saw me now, trudging home to a house filled with strangers, with nowhere to sit and no one to talk to. I wondered if she would have blamed me. I already blamed myself. Back at the house, the renters were watching a movie on the living room projector. I recognized none of the actors, none of the sounds. I slipped past them like a shadow and returned to my room. I sat on the bed and unfolded the city documents again, reading the words until they blurred. I had given away my life for nothing more than a signature. I had given it to a daughter who now ran the home like a business, who used my existence as a selling point for renters who found my presence quaint or harmless. I had no leverage, no recourse, no home, not in the way that word used to mean, something. The next morning, I decided to call an old friend, Daniel Wexler, a retired attorney who had once helped me draft my will. He hadn't heard from me in years, but when I explained what had happened, he invited me to lunch immediately. We met at a small cafe downtown, and I brought the deed papers. Daniel read them carefully, his expression tightening as he turned each page. When he finished, he set them down and looked me in the eye. Harold, you didn't just transfer ownership. You gave her full legal control. There's a clause here that gives her the right to lease, sell, or renovate the property at her discretion. She even added language waiving your right to contest it. I stared at the table, my coffee cold in my hand. Is there anything I can do? I asked. Daniel shook his head slowly. Not unless you can prove she coerced you or that you weren't of sound mind at the time of signing. He paused. Were you? I didn't answer. He continued, the only angle might be the emotional manipulation. If she misrepresented her intentions, maybe we can build a case, but it's a long shot. That night I sat at my desk and wrote a letter to Melissa. I didn't know if I would ever send it. I wrote about Anne, about the apple tree I planted the year she was born, about how I used to carry her on my shoulders when we watched fireworks on the 4th of July. I wrote about how she used to draw me pictures of our house with hearts over it, and how I kept one of them folded inside my wallet, faded and worn, but never discarded. I wrote that I didn't know where I'd gone wrong, that I had tried to be a good father, and that whatever she thought she was doing now, it wasn't right. That she had taken something from me no court could restore, not a house, a home. A sense of place, a meaning. I folded the letter and placed it in my top drawer. I didn't send it, not yet. I wasn't ready to let her see the depth of the hurt, not until I knew what I would do next. Because one thing had become clear. I couldn't stay like this. Not indefinitely. Something had to change. I didn't know how yet, but I knew that the quiet resignation that had defined my days since Anne's death had reached its end. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. That was their mistake. It would be their last. It was just past 8 in the morning when I heard Melissa's voice again. This time, not through the phone or a carefully composed email, but standing right in the foyer, brisk and purposeful, as if she still had the right to enter without knocking. "Dad," she called out, not waiting for a response. I stepped out of my small upstairs room, the one now cluttered with boxes and the scent of sandalwood from someone else's incense, and peered over the banister. She stood there in a crisp blue coat, holding a takeaway coffee and wearing that same professional expression I had seen at least a dozen times in photographs online. Her face framed in LinkedIn updates and real estate ads. She glanced up at me and smiled tightly. "There you are," she said, as though finding me in my own house were somehow surprising. She asked me to come downstairs, said she needed to talk in person because things had become a little complicated. I joined her in the kitchen, now stripped of any sign that it had once been ours. No lace curtains Anne had sewn by hand, no magnets. From family trips, just a sterile countertop lined with oat milk, protein bars, and someone's Bluetooth speaker. Melissa leaned against the counter and took a deep breath as though preparing to deliver a pitch. "Okay," she began. "So, I've been talking to Clark, and we think it's time to have a more sustainable plan for you moving forward." She said it slowly, as though she were worried I might not grasp the vocabulary. I said nothing, just waited. "We've looked into some really nice assisted living options. There's one in Castle Pines that has a wellness center and a shuttle to the town square. They offer art classes. You'd love it." It didn't register at first. I kept staring at her, waiting for a punchline, waiting for her to say she was joking or that she only meant to gauge my reaction. But she didn't smile. She just sipped her coffee and watched me like a doctor watches a patient take bad news. When I asked her what exactly she was trying to say, she said, "I'm saying you can't live here anymore, Dad. This arrangement isn't working. It's not good for you or the tenants. And we've already got a deposit down on a room in Castle Pines. Clark's firm is covering part of the cost as a gesture of appreciation. We'll take care of everything." I stood there in stunned silence, then asked her plainly, "Are you evicting me from my own house?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked at the floor, then said, "It's not your house anymore, legally. We talked about this." And then she had the audacity to add, "This doesn't mean we don't love you. We just want what's best for you." That line, that tired, cruel, paternalistic phrase, was the one that finally broke whatever restraint I had left. I told her that she had no idea what was best for me, that the only time she even remembered I existed was when she wanted something, and that removing me from the only space I had ever called home was not love. It was cruelty, calculated and convenient. She didn't argue. She just crossed her arms and said, "I knew you'd react like this. That's why I made sure to sign the paperwork last week. Legally, you have 30 days to vacate. But we'd like to help you transition sooner, for your comfort. We can have the movers come next weekend." I remember looking at her and seeing not my daughter, but a stranger. I didn't recognize the woman who had once clung to my hand as we crossed a street, who had written me crayon letters on Father's Day, who had cried when her goldfish died and asked me to bury it under the rose bush. This was someone else, efficient, composed, merciless. She left a folder on the table containing the details of the assisted living center, glossy brochures with smiling, gray-haired men playing chess and women painting sunflowers in pastel studios. I didn't touch it. I sat there after she left, not moving, listening to the sounds of people in the living room laughing over a YouTube video. In that moment, I realized it was no longer a house. It had become a business, a transient station, a structure filled with other people's noise. I was being erased from it with surgical precision. That night, for the first time in a long time, I cried. Not the quiet tears of frustration or fatigue, but deep, shaking sobs that came from someplace I hadn't accessed in years. I cried for Anne, for the life we had built, for the illusion I had preserved like a museum exhibit long after it had stopped being real. I cried for the loss of my daughter, not in death, but in some moral collapse that made her capable of orchestrating this betrayal. I cried because I didn't know what I was going to do next, and because I knew that if I didn't act, I would be packed away like an old coat in a donated box, shipped to a room with plastic furniture and a weekly bingo schedule. But beneath that grief, something else began to take shape. It wasn't rage exactly. It was colder than rage. It was clarity. For the first time since Anne died, I understood that no one was coming to save me. Not Melissa. Not the legal system. Not polite phone calls or reasoned arguments. I would have to reclaim what little I had left on my own, and to do that I would have to stop being a polite, grieving widower. I would have to become something else. I didn't yet know what. But I knew this much. I would not go quietly. Not now. Not ever. By the time the movers showed up with cardboard boxes and polite indifference, I had already made up my mind that I would not be going anywhere. I had spent the prior 3 days gathering every document I had ever filed away in drawers, cabinets, and even behind the loose floorboard beneath Anne's old sewing table, assembling a paper trail of my life in this house. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill in my name, every tax record going back to 1982, every photograph of Melissa as a child sitting on the porch steps or opening Christmas gifts under the very ceiling beams she now claimed were no longer mine. I called Daniel again, my friend and former attorney, and told him everything about the eviction, the 30-day deadline, the so-called transition plan to Castle Pines, and most importantly, about the quitclaim deed Melissa had me sign without any discussion of consequences, legal nuances, or what I now believed to be her full intentions from the very beginning. Daniel listened in silence, and when I finished, he let out a long, quiet breath and said, "Harold, you need to come see me immediately." At his office the next morning, I handed over the folder, and he combed through it carefully. His expression was a mixture of anger and resignation, as though he had seen too many cases like mine, yet still couldn't quite believe the cruelty people were capable of when money and convenience stood in the balance. "The deed is valid," he said, "but there are potential angles. You were never provided legal counsel. She presented the documents as a formality, not a transfer of ownership. And the speed with which she began leasing the house and planning your relocation could be interpreted as evidence of premeditated manipulation." He paused, then added, "Especially if we can demonstrate that your age and trust in your daughter were exploited." I nodded. Do whatever you can, I said. I'm not ready to disappear yet. Daniel filed an injunction the following day, and within a week, Melissa received notice of the legal dispute. She didn't respond to me directly, but instead sent a short email with the subject line, "Unnecessary Escalation," where she accused me of undermining her generosity, dragging the family into public drama, and wasting money on lawyers instead of accepting help. She wrote, "You're putting stress on everyone, including yourself. None of this is necessary if you just let us do what's best for you." The sheer audacity of those words would have stunned me 2 months ago. Now, they just strengthened my resolve. The renters kept arriving, though more sporadically now, as Melissa had paused the full listings during the legal hold. Some had already booked in advance and were allowed to stay through the end of their term. One of them, a young man named Caleb, struck up a conversation with me in the backyard one afternoon. He noticed me tending to the garden, what remained of it, and asked if I had always lived here. I told him yes, for over 40 years, and he seemed surprised. "Wow," he said, "that's wild. The listing made it sound like some startup couple just bought the place and were turning it into a co-living thing. You built this garden?" I nodded, and he crouched beside me, staring at the dry, brittle stems of what once had been Anne's prized lilies. "You know," he said slowly, "this place doesn't feel like it belongs to anybody anymore. Just a waypoint. No soul in it, except maybe yours." It was the kindest thing anyone had said to me in months. The court hearing was scheduled for early November. In the days leading up to it, Melissa's demeanor shifted from condescending to coldly aggressive. Her emails became more hostile, her messages more accusatory. She claimed I was becoming paranoid, forgetful, unstable. She suggested in one email to Daniel that I might not be mentally competent to manage my affairs, citing anecdotal examples of confusion and difficulty recalling conversations. That was when Daniel advised I undergo a psychiatric evaluation, not because he doubted my faculties, but because he knew what was coming next. An attempt to have me declared legally incapacitated. The evaluation took place at a private clinic, where I met with 2 separate doctors over a period of several hours. They asked about dates, names, sequences, hypothetical reasoning. I passed every test. One of the doctors even commented on how sharp my memory was for a man my age. "You'd be surprised," I told him. "Being betrayed tends to clear the fog." 2 days later, Melissa escalated her campaign. I received a letter from her attorney stating that she was filing a petition for guardianship, citing concerns for my well-being and alleging that I had exhibited signs of delusion, including persistent belief that he owns the house despite legal transfer and irrational hostility toward those attempting to care for him. It was surreal to read those words, knowing they were being used by my own daughter to strip me of autonomy. But what shocked me even more was that she had already submitted medical documents, fabricated, or at the very least manipulated, to support her case. Daniel moved quickly, obtaining counterstatements from the doctors who had evaluated me, and within a week, her petition was challenged in court. The judge ordered an independent assessment by a third physician, whose report matched the others. I was of sound mind, fully capable of managing my life, and showed no signs of cognitive decline. The petition was dismissed. When the ruling came down, Melissa exploded, not in front of the court, but in the driveway of my house where she had apparently shown up unannounced, banging on the door and demanding I come outside. I did. She was furious, trembling, her face flushed with rage and humiliation. "Why are you doing this to me?" she shouted. "Why are you making this so difficult? I'm your daughter." I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time in my life I saw a woman I did not love. I felt pity, perhaps, but nothing resembling the warmth that once defined my relationship with her. "No," I said softly. "You were my daughter. Now you're just a woman who tried to bury me alive." Clark appeared behind her then, trying to usher her back into their car, whispering something I couldn't hear. She shook him off and kept going. You can't win this, Dad. You don't have the money, the energy, the time. What are you even fighting for? A house? I shook my head. Not a house, a life, my life, the one you tried to rewrite. She turned and left without another word. I stood in the driveway until they disappeared down the street, the late autumn sun casting long shadows over the cracked pavement. Inside, the air felt different. The walls seemed to breathe again. The laughter from the renters didn't feel quite so intrusive. Something had shifted, not in the house, in me. I had faced down the people who tried to erase me, and I had not only survived, I had held my ground. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Daniel and I continued preparing for the main hearing, which would determine whether the original transfer of ownership had been obtained under false pretenses or manipulation. The outcome was uncertain, but I no longer feared it. For the first time in months, I felt steady, anchored not in the illusions I had clung to, but in the truth of what had been done to me. I began documenting everything, every interaction with Melissa, every conversation with tenants, every receipt, email, and bank transaction. I started writing again in Anne's old notebook, not letters to her as before, but entries meant for a record, my record. If no one else would protect my story, I would do it myself. I also contacted a real estate appraiser, curious to know the true value of the home that Melissa had so eagerly tried to monetize. The number they gave me was higher than I expected, a bitter validation of how much she stood to gain by removing me. But I wasn't interested in selling. Not yet. What I wanted now was to regain what had been taken. Not just property, but agency, respect, and perhaps in some quiet way, peace. I had no illusions that Melissa and I could ever return to what we once were. That bridge had burned. What I wanted was finality, something that would allow me to live the remainder of my days not as someone tolerated in a back room, but as someone who had reclaimed his voice after years of silence. I wanted her to understand, not in anger but in truth, that her father had not faded, had not dissolved into a caricature of decline and dependency. I was still here, and I would decide when I left. Not her. The court date fell on a Tuesday, the air brittle with that kind of late autumn chill that creeps through your coat no matter how tightly it's buttoned. I wore the same gray wool suit Anne had picked out for me 2 decades ago, still pressed, still dignified, even though the shoulders no longer fit quite right. Daniel met me outside the courthouse, briefcase in hand, his expression calm but sharpened with quiet focus. Inside the courtroom, Melissa sat across from us, flanked by her attorney, a man with slick hair and a tablet he didn't seem to look away from. She didn't look at me until the judge entered the room, and even then, it was only to shoot me a glance so devoid of anything familial, it chilled me more than the weather outside. It was the look of someone who saw in me, not her father, not a man, but a stubborn obstacle she had failed to sweep away cleanly. I no longer recognized the child I once cradled, or the teenager I once drove to her first dance. She had turned into someone else entirely, someone for whom shame had been traded away for strategy. Daniel presented our case with the kind of patience and clarity that only comes from years of experience. He showed the timeline, how the deed had been signed without independent counsel, how Melissa had immediately begun profiting from the property, how she had attempted to remove me from the home under the guise of care, but had already arranged my removal before ever voicing concern. He presented the evaluations from 3 separate doctors, all affirming my mental clarity. He submitted evidence of the guardianship petition, the fabricated reports, the attempts to control my bank accounts. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood, feeling every joint in my body protest, and walked slowly to the stand. I did not prepare a speech. I didn't read from paper. I looked the judge in the eye, then looked at Melissa, and I spoke. I said that the house wasn't just property, it was memory, history, continuity. That I had built it with my hands, paid for it with decades of labor, planted every tree, fixed every pipe, swept the same porch where I once held Melissa on my shoulders. I said that what had been taken from me wasn't just legal ownership, but the core of what gave my life shape and meaning. I said that when a man reaches a certain age, people stop listening. They assume he's confused, outdated, fragile. But I was not confused. I was not fragile. I was betrayed. Melissa's attorney objected to some portion of my testimony, something about emotional appeals, but the judge overruled him. When I returned to my seat, Daniel placed his hand on my shoulder, just a brief squeeze, enough to say, "That was the moment." When it was her turn, Melissa stood and gave a speech I had heard versions of before, that she loved me, that she worried for me, that I had grown paranoid. She presented herself as the dutiful daughter, the responsible one, the one who had stepped up to manage my affairs when I became increasingly erratic. She referenced phone calls where she claimed I had repeated myself, forgotten basic facts, or confused her with Anne. None of it was true. All of it was calculated. The judge listened, nodding, occasionally making notes. But when he interrupted her and asked why, if she was so concerned for my well-being, she hadn't once invited me to live in her home or offered to take care of me directly, she hesitated. Her mouth opened, then closed again. Her lawyer stepped in, deflecting, saying it wasn't practical with their work schedules, that assisted living had been the more responsible path. The judge didn't press further, but I saw the flicker of recognition in his eyes. He had seen it too, how the concern was transactional, how the affection was performative, how the care had been weaponized to serve convenience and gain. By the end of the hearing, I felt drained, hollowed out like a shell someone had tried to live in without permission. The judge said he would issue a ruling within a week. Melissa didn't wait for me after court. She left the building quickly, her lawyer in tow, walking fast, not looking back. I stood on the courthouse steps, the cold wind tightening around my collar, and breathed in as deeply as I could. I had done what I could. Whatever came next, I had reclaimed something, my voice at the very least, and for a man who had felt erased, that was something. The ruling came 5 days later. Daniel called me in the morning, his voice steadier than usual. "We won," he said. "The judge found sufficient evidence of coercion, financial exploitation, and abuse of trust. The deed is nullified. You're the legal owner of the house again, full owner." I didn't speak for a long moment. I just sat there in the kitchen, my kitchen, and let the words move through me. I looked at the window, the one with the little crack in the corner from when Melissa once threw a softball inside by accident, and I said aloud, to no one in particular, "Thank you." But the relief was only partial. I still had to evict the renters. Legally, they had leases, even if they were misrepresented. It would take time. Paperwork. Daniel helped me file the proper notices, and over the following weeks, one by one, they began to leave. Some quietly, some confused, some apologetic. One of them, Caleb, shook my hand on the way out and said, "I'm glad. This place belongs to someone, after all." When the last of them had packed up and gone, the house was quiet in a way I had not experienced in months. Not the silence of neglect, but of stillness, of possibility. Melissa, unsurprisingly, did not speak to me again. She sent no letters, made no calls, issued no apologies. I knew she might appeal, or attempt something else down the line. I was prepared for that. But I no longer feared her. The hold she had over me, emotional, psychological, had been broken not in court, but in that moment she said the words, "It's not your house anymore." She didn't understand that what she took from me, I could survive. But what she lost, my trust, my love, she would never regain. In the weeks that followed, I made decisions quickly, deliberately. I contacted a realtor. I sold the house. Not out of bitterness, not for revenge, but because it no longer felt like mine in spirit, even if it was again in law. I bought a small condo across town, near a park where I could walk every morning and sit on a bench without hearing footsteps upstairs that weren't mine. I furnished it simply. A good chair, a firm bed, bookshelves, a modest kitchen. I kept only a few of Anne's things: her wedding ring, her favorite teacup, a photo of her laughing on the back porch. The rest I donated or left behind. I didn't need a museum of pain. I needed air. And one morning, sitting by the window with the sunlight on my knees and a cup of tea warming my hands, I realized I didn't feel defeated. I felt reclaimed. Not youthful. Those years were long gone. But solid. Rooted in something other than grief. I had been betrayed by blood, but I had not surrendered. I had been reduced, but not erased. That was the difference. That was everything. The first time I walked into my new condo without a key struggling in the lock or the anxious thought of who might be in the kitchen, I understood what real peace felt like. Not just the absence of noise, but the absence of intrusion. I didn't decorate the place much. I wasn't interested in making it beautiful. I just wanted it to be mine. The furniture was plain but solid, every item chosen by me, paid for with my own money, delivered on my terms. No one else's schedule, no shared closets, no leases to strangers in their 20s with wireless speakers and dietary demands. The quiet here was my own, not imposed, not the silence of being ignored, but the stillness of being free. The mornings became something I looked forward to again. I'd wake early, pour a cup of strong black coffee, open the window slightly to let in the breeze, and write. Not letters to Anne this time, but journal entries to myself. I wrote what I remembered, what I regretted, what I had survived. I wrote about Melissa, not with bitterness but with a clarity that only comes after the worst has happened and you're still standing. I wrote about how much I loved her once and how I no longer did. And I accepted that. Not with coldness, but with truth. Some bonds don't break. They rot. And if you don't cut them, they take you down with them. A few weeks after I moved, I received a letter. Not an email, not a voicemail, but a real envelope with my name handwritten on the front. It was from Ellie, Melissa's daughter, my granddaughter. She apologized for not reaching out sooner, said she had only recently learned the full story, that she had believed her mother when she claimed I was losing it. She wrote that now, after hearing everything, reading what had gone to court, she felt ashamed. She said she missed me. She asked if she could visit. I read that letter a dozen times, each pass through it leaving a different imprint on my chest. Pain, hope, doubt, then something cautious but real. I wrote her back. I said yes. When she came by, she was different. Older than I remembered, more reserved, but sincere. We talked for hours. She asked about Anne, about the house, about what had really happened. I didn't tell her everything. Some things a young woman doesn't need to carry, but I told her the shape of it, the pattern. She listened without defending her mother, which surprised me more than anything. And when she left that afternoon, she hugged me, not out of guilt, but warmth. I hadn't felt that in years. That night I slept the deepest sleep of my life in that small condo, with its bare walls and cheap curtains, because I knew someone still saw me. Not as a problem, not as a burden, just as a man. Sometimes I still walk by the old house. It's been repainted since it sold, the porch rebuilt, new flowers planted that I don't recognize. A young family lives there now. I've seen kids playing in the yard. That doesn't bother me. It comforts me strangely. The house deserved laughter again, real laughter, not rented performance, and I deserved release. I didn't lose everything. I lost what had already been lost, long before I admitted it. I simply stopped lying to myself about where I stood in the lives of those I once put above myself. And once I did that, I found solid ground again. If you had asked me a year ago whether I thought I'd ever live alone again, sleep peacefully again, trust myself again, I'd have laughed in that sad, tired way old men do. But I was wrong. I was not finished. I was not irrelevant. I just needed to walk through the fire to remember who I was without their permission. I may be 76, I may move slower than I used to, but I'm not gone. I'm still here. And now, at last, I am living by no one's mercy but my own.